Section 19 of Astounding Stories 6, June 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Marty on the Central Coast of California. Astounding Stories 6, June 1930, Section 19. The drums were rolling softly in their rhythmic beat. The priest who entered showed annoyance at the delay. They gave a curt order and motioned the three to follow. Outside the corridor was broad, and the double rows of lights on either side glowed brightly to illumine a pageant, grotesque and terrible in its barbaric splendor. The drums throbbed louder. Jerry saw them in their fire of burnished metal, beaten by the bands of naked men. Beyond, a group of warriors waited. Stalwart and strongly muscled, they stood erect in copper armor beside a platform of metal bars, whose floor was of latticed gold. The victims were placed upon it to stand erect. Jerry balanced himself upon the golden floor as the warriors raised it slowly to their shoulders. Priests in robes of heavy golden rope were ranged about. They formed a guard and escort 10 deep about the living sacrifice. At that the drums increased their volume, and to this was added a nerve-racking, discordant and rasping jangle. When sheets of copper, paper thin, were struck with a heavy hand, the pulsing, throbbing pandemonium was terrific as the march began. Slowly they made their way through a winding gallery. Slowly they came to where a portal, high arched, gave entrance upon the great hall. Solemnly, proudly, the priests led the way as they circled the vast room. Their wrappings of gold were a scintillant quiver of light. Above each hard face a circle of gold, symbol of the sun, was borne imperiously high. The priestly guard surrounded the platform where the three standing figures were huddled, and behind, and on either side, the men with the drums and the discordant, ringing sheets gave full force to their blows. The high vault above thundered and roared to the thunder and roar of the drums, and high over all a wailing began. The thin shrillness beat with the tempo of the drums in a pitch that steadily descended. The glittering procession had come to rest at its appointed place in the pathway of light as the wailing came down to a moan. Ong! Ong! The voices groaned, while the walls re-echoed the despairing tones. Only from the band of warriors did the ear of Jerry Foster detect anything but misery and despair. The priests were silent, but the warriors, in their shining armor, stood erect and roared out the syllables in exultant joy. The priests were now upon the dais, the rocky platform, divided by the great, glowing parabola of light. They stood erect as a new high priest, replacing the one Jerry had killed, crossed to bow and grovel in the radiance from their god. The room was silent with the silence of a great tomb as the march of the death began. Softly from the silence the drums resumed the merest whisper of their former thunderous booming. Beside him Jerry heard the soft sobs of a girl. One of the figures swayed and threatened to fall as the platform was lowered to rest upon the floor. The other pressed close to support the drooping figure. Now the entire directed ray of light from the round, glowing hole struck full upon them. It blinded and dazzled, yet plain and distinct Jerry saw at its heart the circle of blackness, the eye of the mysterious, hypnotic parabola, the entrance to what lay beyond. The beat of the drums was hypnotic. As if in a trance he saw, at the sight of the way they must go, the form of the head priest beckon them on. The two victims at his side took one step on the path to their death, and the same stiff rigidity held Jerry as he, too, moved onward and up the golden ramp. The drums were bearing them on. Louder they throbbed in a steady crescendo to carry the three rigid figures a step at a time up the pathway of light. The priest, Jerry felt more than he saw, was beside them. Close ahead was the blackness that held the set stare of his eyes. One of the golden figures was before him. He saw the priest reach out to take the helmet from her head. The movement aroused him from his numb horror. An impulse to escape surged through him, Every nerve was tense and ready for a spring. He looked quickly about. The warriors were behind, the priests ready on their platform to direct them. And in the doorway, from where he had first seen this chamber, on the only way he knew that led to freedom, another figure, tall in his priestly robes, blocked the passage. Hopeless, he knew. And then there swept through him a wave of hate. Gone was his horror, and gone the dull deadness of brain and body. There, facing him, was the mouth of the pit, where waited a something horrible, rapacious, demanding the lives of these people, of Marahna, of others, more and yet more. No thought now of life or escape. For the moment, Jerry Foster's whole being held nothing but hot hate and the wish for revenge. Before him the priest was stripping the robe from the girl at his feet. She stood like a statue, a carving of purest alabaster, slim and erect in her white, slender nakedness, and the face that he saw through incredulous eyes was that of Marahna. Marahna! The realization and quick understanding held him spellbound. She had come, had taken the robes from another poor victim, to be with him in this, the last hour. Marahna, a princess among these strange folk, was giving her life when another could have been in her place, and she smiled tremulously, bravely, as her eyes locked with his, as, speechless and spellbound, he stared through the eyelets of gold. The priest was reaching for his headdress. Jerry tensed. The moment had come. He was ready. As the weight left his shoulders, he dropped, and with one swift movement, his golden disguise. The robe fell in folds at his feet. He stared in silence through narrowing eyes at the face of the head priest above him. Then, leaping straight up, he fastened one hand, sinewy, sun-browned and strong, on the white neck below the white face. They crashed back, to land on the ramp and roll struggling toward the edge. Jerry's hold never slackened. He felt his fingers sink deep in the flesh. He came to his knees, then up, to hold the writhing figure at arm's length. Then, heaving with all his strength, he whipped the man into the air, to drag him in one leaping bound for the sheltering darkness beyond. A figure was entering with him, a slim, naked figure, with glowing and worshipping eyes. Behind them the silence was shattered. Jerry saw as he stepped from the light the riot of figures that surged in hysterical frenzy through the great hall. The priests were leaping among them. The tall priest who had guarded the door was fighting his way through the mob. Jerry loosened his quivering hand from the throat it held. He cast the figure from him, and he blinked his eyes to make them serve him in the blackness all about. Beside him a form, invisible in the dark, was stroking at his face, and a voice was whispering tremulously, "Jerry! Jerry! Jerry!" The tumult in the great hall reached them but faintly. Jerry Foster strove desperately to focus his eyes in that darkness of utter night. A dim glow from the portal crept softly in to bring faint illumination to the farther wall. Slowly his eyes found that which they feared yet sought. Off in the dark, directly opposite the entrance, was a white and ghostly thing, formless and vague. It wavered and blurred to his straining eyes. He fumbled clumsily for a match, one of his treasured store. He must see. He must know what was waiting. The match flared to a point of brilliance in the murky gloom. It showed on the floor where they stood a litter of dried vegetation, food, doubtless placed there as an offering. It was dry now and dusty, and through it there shone the bleak whiteness of bones. Beyond was the floor, and beyond that the whiteness that had been but a blur grew sharply distinct. Jerry could not have told what he expected the light to disclose. Certainly it was not the heaping of coils, milk-white and ghastly, that took the shape before his staring eyes. Above them was a head hung in the air. It was motionless, lifeless almost, like the coiled body that it held. But the eyes, black and staring in the bloated, bulging head, made its poised stillness the more deadly. Even in the dark, Jerry had sensed the hypnotic spell of unseen eyes. Visible, they held him in a rigid, unreasoning terror. Unreal, unthinkable, this serpent-like horror, tremendous and ghastly in its loathsome whiteness. A dweller in the dark, used by the priest as a symbol and a threat for the ignorant folk who trusted and believed them, and it held him, stilled and stricken, in its evil spell. The flame was scorching Jerry's hand that nervously opened to release the match. The man was like a statue, frozen to mental deadness. About his feet a light was playing, unseen. A bit of the dry stuff sprang brightly to yellow flame. Neither seeing nor feeling, the figure of Jerry Foster stood, held in the deadly magic of the malignant eyes. Dimly he sensed that the prostrate body on the floor was that of Marana. Vaguely he knew when the form of the priest took a halting step forward. The fire his match had kindled was rising about his feet. The flames seared and stabbed with a pain that reached his dulled brain. Quivering and shaken, the body of Jerry Foster reacted again to a conscious thought. He leapt quickly as the deadly witchery left him, and he tore at the smoldering cloth with his legs. And now he knew the thing before him for what it was, shocking in its gigantic size, more so in the concentrated venom of its gaze. It was the flabby, scaly, and crusted whiteness of the thing that filled his being with a deadly nausea. He stared with a sickened fascination at the flabby, drooping pouches beside the mouth, the distorted, bulging head, and the short legs, armed with long, curving talons, legs that sprang from out of the neck to clutch and tear at what the jaws might hold. Deadly and hateful, loathsome beyond all imagining, still Jerry Foster found it was something a man could meet. Its devilish power to paralyze, and still the soul of him was gone. He snatched quickly for the gun at his belt and knelt to aim, then checked his finger on the trigger. The figure of the priest had come between him and the monster. The golden robe was dragging. It fell to the floor, to gleam dully in the flickering light of the fire. Against the heaping coils of white the priest was outlined, drawn, as Jerry sensed, against the protest of every fiber of his being. Yet, one stiff step at a time, he went faltering on. The hair above his white face was torn in disarray, and the face itself, so exultantly fierce in its hour of triumph, now a mask of quivering, hopeless terror. The head of the monster came slowly to life. It raised and raised into the air. The mouth gaped open with a hoarse, sucking sound, then struck like a whip of light at the doomed priest. His screams as the thing descended upon him rang through the roar of the .45. Jerry fired again where the black eyes showed above the writhing body of their prey. The head jerked backward to tower in the darkness overhead. The mouth disgorged its contents on the floor. Only for a shuddering instant did the monster pause. Then it launched its great bulk in a counterattack, while the automatic poured out the rest of its futile lead. The gun was knocked from his grasp as the great head smashed past, swerved from its aim by the blinding bullets. Jerry knew only that his knife was in his hand as the great scabrous coils closed inevitably about him. Vaguely he heard shouting from behind as the writhing folds engulfed him. He stabbed blindly at the scaly mass. Again and again his knife ripped slashingly at the abhorrence that grew near him. Then his arm, too, was caught in the crushing, loathsome embrace. He felt no pain. The pressure alone was insufferable. His head was drawn back. Above him the horrible eyes glared into his. There was blood dripping from the jaws. He saw in it the brilliance of a light that flashed in blue heat overhead. There came in his ears a vast roaring of sound, a great heat blast that scorched and burned his face. The crushing pressure was relaxed. He went reeling to the floor as the great coils whirred high into the air. He was stunned by the fall, his body inert and relaxed. But he knew through it all that from somewhere above there was a shrieking of gas, blue roaring flames, a flame that tore blastingly into a writhing contortion beyond. The tall figure of a priest was bending over him, but it was the voice of Winslow that was in his ears, a blessed human voice when it awoke. "Thank God I made it," the voice was saying over and over. "Thank God I found the ship and I got back here in time." There was light within the cavern. The burning fungus was extinguished by the smothering coils that had crushed upon it, but beyond was a waving plume of yellow where a blue flame shot against a wall of rock. And Jerry, through the stress and riot of emotion that overwhelmed him, laughed chokingly, wildly at the words of his companion. "It is sodium," Winslow was saying in explanation, as he saw Jerry's eyes resting on the light. "A hydrogen flame, but there's sodium in the rocks that turns the flame yellow. I rigged up a flamethrower of hydrogen." "You would!" Jerry gasped through hysterical laughter. "You would do just that, and make your way back to this hell just to save me, you damn fool inventor." He clung to Winslow, who was raising him to his feet. Marahna was beside him, robed in the golden garment of the priest. She placed her hands beside his face to turn him toward the further wall. The light was fickle, but it showed him, as it rose and fell, the blackened, swollen body of the monster, still writhing in its death struggle. And beside it, blasted and charred, the head of the obscene sun god, severed by the cutting, obliterating blast, lay flabby and black in a silent heap. "Rather effective," said Winslow complacently, "though I didn't have much to work with. 2 small vials of my liquid and a hand generator to furnish the current. A tubular strut from the frame of the ship made the blowpipe." "And these?" Jerry questioned, and pointed to the priest's vestments that Winslow still wore. "Oh, it was all quiet up above," said the inventor, "and I came down the rope, but there was one of them waiting at the bottom. He didn't need these any more when I left, so I took them to help get about." He stopped to cross quickly and pick up the flamethrower as the flame died away. It roared as he worked at the mechanism, then dwindled again. The light, for an instant, was reflected in a liquid on the floor. "Broken," said Winslow in an anguished voice. "The vials are gone, smashed, and I counted on this to hold off the mob to get us safely out." He regarded the instrument with silent dismay. The blue flame, as he held it, flickered and died. "Not so good," said Jerry slowly. He stopped to retrieve the knife. This, he reflected, was their sole weapon of defense. In the dim light his eyes met with Winslow's in mutual comprehension of their plight. There were caverns beyond, dark and forbidding. Did they lead to the outer world? Or, instead, was it not probable that they went to some deep subterranean dens, from which this monster had learned to come at the priest's summons? Jerry put from his mind all thought of escape in that direction. "And Marahna, too," he told Winslow. "What will become of her?" The girl got the essence of the question. Fumbling for phrases that they knew, she made them believe that she was safe. Her people, she told them, would protect her. "Yes," Jerry agreed. "I guess that's right. She's a princess, you know," he reminded Winslow, "and the great mass of the people look up to her. Only the priest and warrior gangs will be opposed. But how can we get through them?" The question was unanswered. "We've got to knock them cold some way," said the inventor. "Got to give them a fright that will last till they let us get through. Once at the big shaft where we came down, we can make our getaway. But how to do it?" His voice died away in dismal thought. Jerry's eyes were casting about. The priest's robe? No, not good enough. It had brought Winslow through, but it couldn't take them back. Marahna? No help there. She had enough to do to protect herself from the fury of the priests. End of section 19. Recorded by Marty on the Central Coast of California. Section 20 of Astounding Story 6, June 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marty on the Central Coast of California. Astounding Story 6, June 1930. The Moon Master. His eyes rested again on the steaming, blackened mass that still showed the horrible features that had marked the head of the monster. The sun god. There was an idea there. "Come," he said to Winslow, and walked swiftly across to the severed head. He had to steel his nerves before he could lay hands upon the vile thing. The paws were still attached behind the head. He took a grip on one and pulled. The great mass moved. "I don't get the idea," said Winslow. "Nor I," Jerry admitted. "But there's an idea here." His thoughts were racing in the moment's silence. "I've got it," he shouted. "I've got it. If only I can make Marahna understand." He led the girl nearer to the door, where his signs could be seen more plainly. "You," he told her, "go out there." He pointed to the place where the priest had stood.
Tell your people."
He took the attitude of the orator declaiming to his audience.
"We have come here from the sun."
Again his signs were plain. Marahna nodded. This plainly was literal truth to her.
"Tell them,"
he continued earnestly,
"we have saved them from this thing. Tell them it was no sun god, but a monster that the priests had kept." "Monster!"
he exclaimed, and pointed to the head and to the body that still writhed and jerked spasmodically.
"No god, no."
And again the girl showed her understanding. Her eyes were glowing.
"Then,"
said Jerry, indicating Winslow and himself,
"we will take the head that they have worshipped, and we'll drag it out and throw it to the priests."
His gestures were graphic. The girl nodded her head in an ecstasy of comprehension.
"And then,"
Jerry added softly for Winslow's hearing,
"we'll beat it, and with luck we'll make it safe."
"There's a chance," said Winslow softly. "There's a chance, and that's all we ask."
"It's up to you, Marahna,"
Jerry told her. His words were meaningless, but the tone sufficed. She drew herself proudly erect, wrapped herself closely in the robe of the braided gold, and stepped firmly and fearlessly through the portal and down toward the platform of the priests. The two men watched from the shadows. Beyond the outline of the platform they saw the warrior clans, a phalanx of protecting bodies, and beyond, drawn back in huddled consternation, were masses of white-faced people, Marahna's people, who listened now in wondering silence to their princess. Marahna made her way slowly to the platform's edge. All of the countless ones to have gone that road, she was the first ever to return. She stood silent while her eyes found their way scornfully over the enemy below. Then, looking beyond them, she began to speak. Her soft voice echoed liquidly throughout the room. She gestured, and Jerry knew that she was giving them the message. From the priests there came once a hoarse, inarticulate growl of hate and unbelief. She silenced them with her hand. She pointed to the heavens, and she told them of the sun, and of the two who were true children of the sun, who had come to save them from their false god. Her voice rose as she told her people in impassioned tones that which she had seen, and she was shouting above the tumult of the priests, and pointing directly at them as she made the roof echo with the message. "On Diva! On Diva!"
"The god is dead,"
translated Jerry.
"Diva means death. She said that of herself before we left."
"Come on!" he shouted, and laid hold of one great claw.
"It's our turn now."
Winslow was tugging at the other foot. Between them they dragged into the light the obscene burden. Down the long ramp they took it, and off upon the platform of the priests, where Marahna waited. The priests, as Jerry's quick glance showed, were milling wildly about. It seemed that a charge was soon to follow, but the commotion ceased as the two men come upon the platform, hauling between them the great scorched head of Ong. The vast hall was without movement or sound as they made their way out to the front. Jerry stood erect and faced the crowd. He pointed, as had Marahna, toward the sun somewhere above those thick masses of rock. He traced it in its course across the sky. He pointed to Winslow and himself, and in loudest tones he roared throughout the room his message.
"Ong!"
he shouted.
"Ong Diva!"
"I'll count 3, he whispered in the utter silence.
"Then let her go."
Again he took a firm hold on the flabby paw. 1, he whispered, and swung his body with the word.
2 and 3.
The men heaved mightily upon the gruesome horror. The head swung ghastly in scorched whiteness into the air. The dead jaws fell open as it crashed downward among the huddled, stricken priests. "This way," commanded Winslow. He had been carefully appraising the openings in the crowd. "And don't hurry. Remember, you're a god to them, or something a darn sight worse." Heads proudly erect, the two strode firmly down the pathway of golden light. The room was silent as the few they met fell back in cringing fear. Slowly, interminably, the long, triumphal march was made across the rocky cavern of the moon. Not till they reached the portal did the silence break. The shrieks of the priests and the clashing of copper were behind them as they vanished with steady steps from out of the room. "Now run," ordered Winslow. "Run as if the devil from hell were after you, and I think they are." The two tore madly down the corridor, whose double rows of brightness made possible their utmost speed. There was the narrowing of the passage. Jerry remembered it, where they came out at the foot of a great shaft, the dead throat of the volcano. Beyond them the shrieks and clamor echoed close. A rope was dangling from far up at the top. Jerry leaped for it before he recalled the condition of his arm. In the excitement of the encounter he had forgotten that the arm was still in no shape for a long hand-over-hand climb.
"I can't make it,"
he said, and looked about quickly. There were baskets of fungus growth, already dried from the heat of the midday sun that had shone where it grew. He dragged one to the narrow part of the tunnel. Winslow tugged at another and threw it up as a barricade. A chalk-white figure in copper sheathing was clambering upon it as he worked at another of the nets. Jerry let go of the fiber basket he was dragging and drew his knife as he sprang to meet the assault. A sharp cutting edge was unknown to these workers in copper. Jerry slipped under the raised, bludgeoning copper weapon to plunge the knife into a white throat. Then, without a look at the body, he helped Winslow, struggling with another load. They completed the barricade. A heap of fungus made a raised place where Jerry leaped, commanding the top of the pile that blocked the choked throat of the passage. He was ready for the next figure that leaped wildly up. It would take them a while, Jerry saw, to learn of this scintillant death that struck at them from close quarters. His knife flashed again and again as he took the men one at a time and let their limp bodies roll back to the passage beyond. The assault was checked when Jerry shouted to his companion.
"Tie the rope around me,"
he ordered,
"up under my arms. Then you go up. When you get there, pull up, and for the Lord's sake, pull fast." "Go on," he shouted. "I can hold them for a while."
He turned swiftly to take a leaping body upon the red point of his knife. He felt the rope about him as he fought, knew by its twitching when Winslow started the long climb, and prayed dumbly for strength to hold his weak fortress till the other could hoist him up to the top. He was fighting blindly as they came on in endless succession, the figures of frenzied priests leaping grotesquely beyond. Only the strategic position he had taken allowed him to turn the wild assault again and again. They could only reach him by ones and twos, but the end must come soon. There were priests tearing at the foot of the barricade. The cold winds that came down from above revived him, but it helped the figures ripping at the fiber cords. The dry fungus fragments whirled gaily away and down the passage in the wind. The wind! The draft was blowing from him, directly upon his attackers. Jerry struggled and clinched with another that bound beside him, and knew as he fought that a weapon was at hand. His knife found the lower edge of copper, and the figure screamed as he rolled it down the slope. He slipped the knife into his left hand as he fumbled with his right. His precious matches! He struck one on the rock. It broke in his trembling fingers. Another! There were so few left. He drew it with infinite care at the surface of rock. The figures below tore in frenzy at the weakening barricade, while yet others stood waiting at this sign of some new form of magic. They shouted again, as they had when, those long days ago, he had lighted a cigarette before their horrified gaze. Jerry shielded the tiny blaze in his hand to bring it beneath a papery leaf beside him. The flame flashed and dwindled. He dared not drop back to set fire to the base of the heap. But even in the exhaustion and strain of the moment, Jerry Foster still knew the value of the showman's tricks in reaching the fears of these white-faced fighters. With grandiloquent gesture he raised another of the tindery fragments and ignited it from the first. Another, and he had the beginning of a fire. He lit another piece, and when he had it blazing, dropped it behind him, and kept on with the show. A large piece became a flaming torch, and he waved it before him and laughed to see the warriors cringe. A cloud of smoke was billowing about him. He leapt to safety through a rising wall of flame. The rear slope of the barricade became a furnace. The wind behind him swept the smoke clouds down the passage. He heard and sank back weakly on the ground as it came to him, the screaming riot where a mob of terrified warriors fought and struck to turn the horde that clamored behind them and pushed them on. The blast roared over the heaped fuel and poured downward from the crest. The noise of the retreat went silent in the distance. Spent and exhausted, Jerry Foster lay panting upon the stone floor. The breath of cold and life came down the long shaft from the crater. Had Winslow gained the top? Was he equal to the climb? Jerry hardly felt the jerking of the rope about his shoulders, but he knew as, in frantic haste, it drew him scraping up the long side of the shaft. The biting cold above revived him, and again a scene of desolation was spread before his eyes. Winslow fumbled with knots and released him from the rope. "Come on!" he shouted, and extended a helping hand as they leaped and raced across the rocky floor. Jerry again was vividly, strongly alive as the cold wind swept him. He leaped hugely through the whirling wisps of dried-out vegetation. The sun had stripped the surface of every living thing. Again the rocky slopes rose naked in the rosy light of evening. The sun was hidden below a distant range of jagged hills. The long night was begun.
"You're going the wrong way," Jerry shouted. "We left it over there."
He stopped to point where the sun had set.
"See? That's where we fought the beasts."
"Come on," repeated Winslow. "Hurry! We mustn't lose out now. I flew the ship over this way while I was up here before." A ridge of rock cut off the view where Winslow pointed.
"Bully for you!"
Jerry shouted and turned to follow. They stopped as the slope ahead, from its multitude of honeycombed caverns, erupted men. The priests were ahead, and behind them swarmed their men. Vindictive and revengeful, the wily enemy was fighting to the end. The two stopped in consternation.
"What's the use?"
demanded Jerry. His voice was tired, utterly hopeless.
"And the ship's right over there."
"A million miles away, a million miles away," said Winslow slowly, "as far as we're concerned." The army was sweeping down the long slope. They had found their quarry. There were other figures, too, pouring from the throat of the volcano, white, naked figures that swarmed in growing numbers and rushed upon them from the rear.
"Trapped," said
Jerry Foster savagely.
"and we almost made it."
He rose wearily to his feet.
"We'll take it standing."
The armored warriors were approaching. In leaping triumph they raced to be the first ones at death. The shouts of the priests were ringing encouragement in their ears, but the leaders from the rear were nearer. One deep breath Jerry drew as he turned to meet them, then stared astonished as the figures swept past. They streamed by in confusion. They were armed with rocks, with clubs or copper metal. Some even carried bars of gold above their heads. They came in a great swarm that swept past and beyond them, and they met, like an engulfing wave, the bounding figures of the men in copper. Smothered and lost were the warriors in the horde that poured increasingly on. The wave, before Jerry's eyes, swept on over the crest, while he stood in amazed unbelief at the battle that raged. It was Marahna who brought understanding. He turned to see her kneel in sobbing, thankful abasement at his feet. Marahna! Her people! She had saved them! There was time needed for the full force of the truth to banish the hopeless despair from his heart. Then he stooped to raise the crouching figure with arms that were suddenly strong. The pale rose light of the departed sun above shone softly within a rocky valley of the moon. It tipped the tall crags with lavender hues, and it touched with soft gleaming reflections a blunted cylinder of aluminum alloy. The valley was silent, save for the hushed whispers of wondering thousands of people, the enclosing hills, and the rushing roar from the cylinder itself where the inventor was testing his machine. There were figures in priestly robes, scores of them, and they were surrounded by a white throng that, silent and watchful, held them captive. Beyond in the open, where bare rock made a black rolling floor, there were two who stood alone, the golden figure of a girl, and beside her Jerry Foster, in wordless indecision. Behind him was the ship. Its muffled thunder came softly to his unheeding ears. He looked at the girl steadily, thoughtfully. Gone was all trace of her imperious dignity. The Princess Marahna was now all woman, and Jerry, looking into her dark eyes, read plainly the yearning and adoration in their depths. The Princess Marahna had forgotten her deference to the god in her love for the man. The tale was told in her flushed face, openly unashamed, and his gray eyes were thoughtful and tender as he gazed into hers. He was thinking, was Jerry Foster, of many things, and he was weighing them carefully. His hand clasped and unclasped at something safely hidden in his pocket. He had taken it from his pack. He had wanted something from Marahna, something she would treasure, and now she was offering him herself. He could take her with him, take her to that far-off world that she never dreamed existed. He could show her the things of that world, its wonders and beauties. He could train her in its ways. He could watch over her, love her, and she would be miserable and heartsick for the sight of this awful desolation. He knew it. He told himself it was the truth, and he hated himself for the telling. The voice of Winslow aroused him. The inventor had come from the ship. "We had better be starting," he said. The slim figure of the girl in her robe of pure gold trembled visibly. She knew, it was plain, the import of the words. She spoke rapidly, beseechingly, in her own tongue. The words were liquid music in the air. Then, realizing their importance, she resorted to her poor vocabulary of their own strange sounds. "No, no," she said, and shook her head vehemently. "No, no." She motioned to wait, and she called loud and clear across the silence to her own people. There was a stir about the priests. One in the robes and headdress of the high priest was brought forward, led by two others of her men. They stopped a few steps from her and bowed low. Again she called, and the leaders among the vast throng came too, and made their obeisance before her. She turned then to Jerry, and now it was Marahna, Princess of the Moon, who stood quiet and poised before him. The light, he saw, made soft wavelets of radiance in her hair, and her eyes were still glowing and tender. She stepped forward toward the priest. The helmet of the sun god was upon his head. It marked him, Jerry knew, as the master of their world. True, they had bowed in submission to that other master, whose vile head lay horrible and harmless on the floor of the great hall. They had believed in the commands of the priest that pretended to receive from him, but this emblem on their helmet marked the leader of the race, the master of this world, for these simple folk. Marahna reached her slim hands and lifted the thing of gold. She turned and held it above the startled eyes of Jerry Foster, and she placed it upon his head with all the dignity that became a queen. A word from her, and the men before him dropped in humbleness to the ground. The Princess Marahna was among them in honoring salutation to their king. Jerry was beyond speech. Not so Winslow. "It looks to me," he said dryly, "as if you were being offered the kingdom of the earth. I mean the moon. Think it over, Jerry. Think it over." And Jerry Foster thought it over, deeply and soberly. He could rule this people, he and Marahna, rule in peace and quiet and comfort. He could bring them knowledge and wisdom of infinite help. He could make their new civilization a measure of advancement for a whole race. He could teach them, train them, instruct them, and he and Marahna, there would be children who would be princes born, could be happy for a time, and then he would be old, old and lonely for his kind, hungering and longing for his own people. As Marahna would be on earth, so would he be here. His decision was formed, and with it he knew he must not hurt the heart of Marahna. She loved him, Jerry Foster, the man. He must leave her as Jerry Foster, the god, child of the sun. He stood suddenly to his full height, and who shall say that for a moment the man did not approach the stature of divinity, for he was wholly kind. He placed a hand upon the head of the kneeling girl before him. He held her in her submissive pose. Then, turning to the waiting men, he spoke in measured tones.
"I thank you,"
he said, and the words came from a full heart.
"But my place is not here. I leave with you one more worthy."
Before their wondering gaze, he removed the glowing circlet from his head. He leaned to place it on the head of Marahna, humbled before him. With strong hands he raised her to her feet. His look, so tender yet reserved, was full of meaning. She followed his every sign. He waved once toward the sun, hidden behind the distant hills. He pointed again to Winslow and himself, and to their shining ship, and again he marked the going of the sun. His meaning was plain. These children of the sun must return to their far-off home. He turned now to Marahna. In his hand was the object he had taken from his pack. It was a treasured thing, this locket of platinum on its thin and lacy chain. It had been his mother's, and he thought of her now as he opened the clasp to show his own face framed within the oval. His mother, she had worn this, and she would have approved, he knew, of its disposal. Gravely he faced Marahna. He showed her the picture within the case, then held it aloft where all might see. He closed it and taught her the pressure that released the spring. Then, with gentle dignity that made of a gesture a rite, he placed the chain about the neck of Princess Marahna, queen now of the people of the moon, and he knew that he gave into her keeping their only relic of being from the sun. It marked her beyond all future question with a symbol of mastery, and it made of him a god, and even a queen may not aspire to such a one. It was well that Winslow's hand was there to guide him as he walked with unseeing eyes toward the ship. Time may lose at times all meaning and measure. Moments become timeless. It seemed ages to Jerry Foster when Winslow spoke in casual tones. "I'm going straight up," he said above the generator's roar. "Then we'll swing around above the other side. We'll follow the sun, make the full circle of the moon before we start." But Jerry neither thought nor heard. His eyes were close to a window of thick glass. Below him was a shrinking, dwindling landscape, windswept and desolate. There was a multitude of faces turned worshiping toward the sky. On one who stood apart in tiny loneliness his vision centered. He watched and strained his aching eyes until the figure was no more. Only the pale rose of a dying sun and a torn volcanic waste that tugged strangely at his heart.
"Yes,"
he answered mechanically.
"Yes, we'll go around with the sun. A couple of sun gods."
He laughed strangely as he regarded his companion. If Winslow wondered at the weariness in the voice, he made no sign. He was busy with a rheostat that made thunderous roaring of the blast behind their ship, that swung them in a sweeping arc through velvet skies, away from the far side of the moon, to follow the path of the setting sun, homeward bound. End of Section 20, recorded by Marty on the Central Coast of California. End of Astounding Story 6, June 1930.
Section 21 of Astounding Stories 06, June 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. Astounding Stories 06, June 1930. The Reader's Corner, a meeting place for readers of astounding stories. The Reader's Corner. Second better than first. Dear Editor, the second number of Astounding Stories is better than the first. Spawn of the Stars by Charles Willard Diffin was the best story, closely followed by Creatures of the Light by Sophie Wenzel Ellis and The Beetle Horde by Victor Rousseau. I like stories of vibration as in Mad Music, and of acceleration as in The Thief of Time. I am glad to see Harl Vincent in the pages of Astounding Stories. I have read many good stories by him. Interplanetary stories are my favorites, and the more you have of them the better. I wish that you would put Astounding Stories out twice a month, or put out a quarterly containing twice as much reading material as the monthly. In this you could put one book-length novel and a few shorter stories. Are you going to start a department containing the reader's letters soon? Jack R. Darrow, 4225 North Spaulding Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. Size and Paper. Dear Editor, I certainly am glad to see your magazine appear on the newsstands. I also view with appreciation the fact that you have such brilliant authors as Harl Vincent and Captain S. P. Meek, USA, on your list of contributors. Your stories are of the very highest value in the line of science fiction. However, I did not like The Corpse on the Grating. It did not have an inkling of scientific background. I really am surprised it was published in a science fiction magazine. Aside from the fact that the idea of the story was merely a fantastical surmise, I was very favorably impressed with the author's style and his use of the English language. Why don't you try for some more of the works of the other well-known authors in this line of fiction? My main object in writing this letter was that I think you rub the name of science fiction in the dust by printing it on such paper and in such a small magazine. If you intend to compete with your several contemporaries, you will almost have to alter your size and quality of your paper. You might include a full-page illustration for each story also. But you will admit that to combat these other influential science fiction magazines, you will have to put your magazine on a par materially with the others in your line. I admire the type of stories which you publish and want to see your magazine get ahead. Warren Williams, 545 Dorchester, Chicago, Illinois. They Will. Dear Editor, I am a monthly reader of your Astounding Stories, and I am greatly interested in them. The best story I have so far read is Creatures of the Light. It is a story of super science indeed. If the author of this story would write more like it, I am sure they would be greatly appreciated. Here is hoping that more of their kind appear in the very near future. Yours for more good stories, Quentin Stockman, 245 Dixon Street, Portland, Oregon. Surpasses the First. Dear Editor, I have just finished the February issue of your magazine. It surpasses the first issue by far. I am glad to see that you have 8 stories in this issue. That is just enough. I like one serial, not too long, 1 or 2 novelettes, and 5 or 6 short stories in each issue. Tell Captain S.P. Meek to write more adventures of Dr. Bird. I have arranged the stories of the first 2 issues according to my own liking. Excellent. The Beetle Horde and Phantoms of Reality. Good. The Care of Horror. Tanks and Invisible Death. Fair. The Stolen Mind and Compensation. In the second issue, excellent. Creatures of the Light, Old Crompton's Secret, The Beetle Horde, and Spawn of the Stars. Good. The Thief of Time and Mad Music. Fair. The Corpse on the Grating and Into Space. I hope there will be more stories under excellent next month. Ward Elmore, 2012 Avenue J, Fort Madison, Iowa. Only One Trouble. Dear Editor, I have just finished reading your new magazine and think it's great. The only trouble with it is that it doesn't have enough stories. I liked Phantoms of Reality by Ray Cummings best, and The Cave of Horror by Captain S.P. Meek next best. The Beetle Horde and Tanks were also good. Ray Cummings and S.P. Meek are among my favorite science fiction authors. I like best interplanetary stories and stories of the aircraft of the future. I would like to see a good interplanetary story by R.H. Romans in this magazine pretty soon. Other good authors whose stories I would like to read are Dr. David H. Keller, Dr. Miles J. Brower, Lilith Lorraine, Ed Earl Repp, and Walter Cateley. In your editorial you mention the fact that some day in the future a person can disintegrate his body in New York and reintegrate it in China. I would like to see a good story about that by either Ray Cummings or S.P. Meek. Something else. Why not make your magazine a little bigger and include a scientific article or 2 once in a while? J. W. Latimer, 1000 East 8th Street, National City, California. No Horror Stories. Dear Editor, I am taking this opportunity to let you know what I think of Astounding Stories. The worst fault is the tendency to print terror stories. Please don't do this. If I never see another story like The Corpse on the Grating in your magazine, it will be too soon. Don't print so many detective stories. Captain Meek's splendid stories are plenty. Please start a discussion column and put Wesso's drawings inside the magazine, too. Are you planning on any reprints? I would like to see some reprints of Ray Cummings, A. Merritt's, H.G. Wells, Garrett Smith's, and George A. England's stories soon. Phantoms of Reality, The Beetle Horde, The Cave of Horror, Into Space, Creatures of the Light, and Old Crompton's Secret were splendid. I hope for fewer detective stories and no horror stories. Joe Stone, 123 20th Street, Toledo, Ohio. We liked it too. Dear Editor, just a line to tell you that I bought my first copy of Astounding Stories, and they certainly are good, especially Creatures of the Light by Sophie Wenzel Ellis. It's the best short story I've read in ages. I hope to read more by her in the future. Yours for success, F.J. Michaelslow, Battery D, Fort Hancock, New Jersey. Strikes a Mystic Chord. Dear Editor, I think that your Astounding Story magazine is a fine magazine. It seems to strike a mystic chord within me, and makes me respond to it. One thing lacking, I believe, that is, a department for letters from your readers. Spawn of the Stars is certainly a fine scientific story. I wish that the author of Into Space would write a sequel to his story. Ronald Bainbridge, Rockford, Illinois. We're avoiding reprints. Dear Editor, I am writing again about Astounding Stories. It seems more people are interested in science today than ever before, and an easy and interesting way to gain this knowledge is through reading an entertaining science story. Regarding stories in your February issue, we'll list them according to my likes and dislikes. Into Space and Mad Music contained science maybe not impossible in the future. Spawn of the Stars, The Beetle Horde, Creatures of the Light, The Thief of Time, and Old Crompton's Secret were very interesting science and good reading, but The Corpse on the Grating did not appeal to me. I like interplanetary stories and stories of what might be on other planets. I noticed some familiar names among your authors. Why not print some, not too many, stories from H.G. Wells, E.R. Burroughs, and Jules Verne? Some of their stories, which were considered just wild dreams of the author at the time of writing, have actually become a reality, as, for instance, The Submarine. If you keep on as you started or improve, I can see only success. C. E. Anderson, 3504 Colfax Avenue South, Minneapolis, Minnesota. A few favorites. Dear Editor, I am an electrical engineer. I read the last 2 issues of your magazine. I liked it very much. It is thrilling and very well edited. I will buy it regularly. I liked Invisible Death best. The Beetle Horde was good. Phantoms of Reality good. Into Space and Mad Music very good. Creatures of the Light, Old Crompton's Secret, and Spawn of the Stars good. Adolf Wasserrogel, Gedden Terrace, Waterbury, Connecticut. Going Some. Dear Editor, I purchased one of your magazines when I first saw them. I always had a liking for super science stories, but your magazine was the best I ever got hold of. Thought I could never wait until the next issue to finish. The Beetle Horde. I believe The Cave of Horror was the best story in that issue. It really seemed as if it could be true. Due respect must be paid to the author of The Corpse on the Grating, for it was exciting and fantastic. Phantoms of Reality was good. All the stories in the second magazine seemed as good as the best of the first number, and that's going some. May you succeed in getting the same good and better stories as you have in the first 2 issues of a magazine that I am sure will grow to fame. Harold Rakestraw, Box 25, Winthrop, Washington. We intend to. Dear Editor, having read the first 2 issues of your new magazine, I find it has a larger variety of stories than any of the other science fiction magazines now found on the newsstands. Why not keep it that way? It will be unique. Mr. Wesolowski, your artist, is great. He is one who can draw when it comes to a good scientific background. I consider Tanks your best story as yet, with Spawn of the Stars close behind. Invisible Death, Creatures of the Light, and Mad Music were also good. Try to give us some stories by Edgar Rice Burroughs and A. Merritt. Did not think much of The Beetle Horde. Too many like it. Ted Shatkowski, 812 Hoffman Street, Hammond, Indiana. Some good suggestions. Dear Editor, I received the pleasure of purchasing a copy of Astounding Stories the other day. The first copy I have seen. I have not yet read it, but I am unable to wait that long to inform you of my great joy in greeting a new magazine of this type. I am a reader of other magazines similar to A.S. Stories, of Harl Vincent, Captain S.P. Meek, Murray Leinster, and others appear in these magazines, also, so I am familiar with your authors. But you have asked me what sort of stories I'd like to see in A.S., so here goes. First of all, I would earnestly beg you not to print such stories as those that deal with ghosts, etc., because in my opinion there are far too many good stories available to cast them aside for trash. The type of story I prefer is the kind that is fanciful, odd, and interesting. Some tales deal with a new invention of some sort, but contain no action or plot. However, I fail to see any like that in the present A.S., unless it's Mad Music. A few utterly impossible stories are so interestingly told that it is worth while to publish them. Some examples are stories by A. Merritt, whose stories are the most fascinating I have ever read, H.P. Lovecraft, master of the bizarre and the grotesque, and G.A. England. My letter seems to be mostly composed of suggestions, but that is only because I am interested in anything pertaining to stories of imagination, or science fiction, as it is called. However, Astounding Stories seems to be very satisfying to me. I am glad that you have Wesolowski on your artist's staff. I hope that you will have a story contest sometime in the future, as they are very interesting, and often uncover hitherto unknown talent in the contestants. I sincerely wish you the utmost of success in Astounding Stories, and hope that it will live a long, enduring life. I hope, as time goes on, you will favor us with more illustrations, for this type of story needs a large amount of drawings, so that the readers won't overwork their imaginations. Astounding Stories seems to be very shy, for I heard of it from a friend and got the February 1930 issue only after an exhaustive search. The place where I got it appears to be about the only one in town selling it. I hope more stores will handle your great magazine. I didn't intend the word great magazine to be sarcastic. I really think it's great. I hope you will have a department in which the readers may discuss the merits or lacks of stories published, or at least print excerpts now and then. Enclosed find 20 cents in stamps, for which please send me the first issue. A. W. Bernal, 1374 East 32nd Street, Oakland, California. Stories I Like Best. Dear Editor, the stories I like best in your Astounding Stories of Super Science were The Beetle Horde by Victor Rousseau, The Cave of Horror by Captain S.P. Meek, Compensation by C.V. Tench, Invisible Death by Anthony Pelcher. I have just bought your second copy of Astounding Stories. I like the book very much and expect to buy it every month. Isaac Dworkowitz, 1262 Valentine Avenue, Bronx, New York. Just What is Needed. Dear Editor, I have read the first 2 copies of your new magazine, and I would like to make a few comments and criticisms. This magazine is very popular in my community, and is just what is needed to instill scientific interest in the mind of the general public. Science fiction will arouse more interest and will be read by more people than any amount of dry science and cold facts. Since you would like to have a reader's opinion, I will say that The Beetle Horde is the best story that I have read in a long time, and was based on the most excellent science. The Thief of Time was good. Try to get some more stories by Captain S.P. Meek. One in every copy would not be too many. I could not get all het up over Spawn of the Stars. It was a little vague. I do not think the author had a very distinct idea about the nature of the invaders. The stories do not have to stick to cold science, but should not violate an established fact without a reasonable explanation, as this might cause a mistaken idea in the minds of the readers. A few good authors are Dr. Keller, A. Hyatt Verrill, Walter Catley, and R. H. Romans. Wayne Bray, Campbell, Missouri. Literature that typifies New Age. Dear Editor, as a member of an organization whose existence was founded through the medium of science fiction, I have watched your magazine closely, and here are the results. It is all science fiction, virile, interesting, and new. A popular edition of these stories with the name of a great publishing house behind it. The authors you have acquired are supreme in this field. Ray Cummings and Captain Meek need no introduction, and Harl Vincent is a notable addition whose stories of indefinite extension and interplanetary travel are well known to science fiction fans. Science fiction, first introduced by Verne, Poe, Wells, Haggard, and other old masters in this line, is a type of literature that typifies the new age to come, the age of science. And, in conclusion, may I say that the Science Correspondence Club extends to your new and most acceptable publication heartiest wishes for continued and increasing success. I subscribe myself to the advancement of science and science fiction. Walter P. Dennis, FPS, 4653 Addison Street, Chicago, Illinois. Keep up the good work. Dear Editor, I have just completed the perusal of the first issue of Astounding Stories, and am immensely pleased. I am a high school senior, and though have only a rudimentary knowledge of science, the subject impresses me, and I am eager to gain new facts and food for thought. I compliment you on securing the services of such writers of scientification as Ray Cummings, Harl Vincent, R.F. Starzl. They are good. Ray Cummings' impressive style, his vivid imagination, and his knowledge of his subject seem to me invincible. His stories are always welcome. Now, concerning the services of other writers of science fiction, I think the majority of the readers will be well pleased with the following list: Edgar Rice Burroughs, A. Hyatt Verrill, H. G. Wells, David H. Keller, Otis Adelbert Klein, and Stanton Coblentz. The above mentioned, I am sure, would greatly please your readers. I believe it would greatly improve the circulation of your magazine to try to secure the services of such writers, especially E. R. Burroughs. I am greatly interested in the future of your magazine, and wish it every bit of luck in the world. You have made an astounding start. Keep up the good work. A. G. Jowett, Jr., 132 Murdoch Avenue, Asheville, North Carolina. The Reader's Corner. All readers are extended a sincere and cordial invitation to come over in the Reader's Corner and join in our monthly discussion of stories, authors, scientific principles and possibilities, everything that's of common interest in connection with our astounding stories. Although from time to time the editor may make a comment or so, this is a department primarily for readers, and we want you to make full use of it. Likes, dislikes, criticisms, explanations, roses, brickbats, suggestions, everything is welcome here, so come over in the Reader's Corner and discuss it with all of us. The Editor. End of Section 21, The Reader's Corner. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. End of Astounding Stories, 06 June 1930.